Welcome to Season 2 of Let's Break Up, Toxic Workplace Stories. Join hosts Nicola and Gina as they tackle workplace toxicity head-on. Real-life stories, well-being, and standing against toxicity await you. Let's break up with toxic workplaces and create a revolution of positivity together.
As a disclaimer, Nicola and Gina's opinions are solely their own and don't represent professional advice. It's just their perspective, so form your own conclusions. Heads up, this podcast may contain adult content and explicit language. So let's dive in and break up with toxic workplaces.
Okay, let's try that again. Shea, would you like to tell us who you are and where you're from?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk about neurodiversity in the workplace, what it means to be autistic in a working environment, and how much of a fun time, how much of an interesting time, and how much of a challenging time it is being neurodivergent and more broadly disabled in a traditional 9-to-5 corporate job. I currently live outside of Boston, Massachusetts in the United States. I live with my fiance and 2 cats. The cat might come up and say hi in the microphone at any point, so be prepared to hear him meow at some point.
I am so excited about this episode. I think this is going to be a really, really interesting episode because I think this is kind of the first time that we're deep diving into this topic. And I think
with someone who identifies as neurodivergent, we've had people tell their stories and say, I think my coworker might have been neurodivergent because they acted like X, Y, and Z. And there was a few incidents where we were like, doesn't sound like that to us. Like, you're probably the problem. But then there was a couple that I think Nicola and I were like, yeah, something sounds a little off there. I wonder what it was. Like, we're not doctors, obviously. We're not handing out diagnoses. But so I think it's going to be really interesting to hear from an actual person.
An actual person.
A real human.
Are you actually a person, or are you
I hope I'm a real person.
lizard dressed in a flesh suit?
I have the burn marks and the cuts and the scabbed over pimples and scrapes to prove the fact that I am human.
We'll give it to you. You are an actual person.
Thank you for the accomplishment, the achievement. I'll put it on my whiteboard.
Put it on your LinkedIn profile. I'm an actual person.
Actual real human beings, certified. 2023. Organic.
I'm curious to know, like, as we kind of head into this podcast, because obviously I'm hoping that you're going to share a little bit of your neurodiversity, and you've mentioned that you're autistic as well. Yep. I'm curious to know, and maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit for me. Sarcasm is our second language, Gina and I. How are you with sarcasm?
50-50. If it's really obvious, I'll pick up on it. If it's subtle, it might fly over my head.
Okay.
So I would say give it a try.
I feel like I'm right there with you with the subtlety. Sometimes I'm like, I'll think about it after and I'll be like, wait, was that a joke or not? Like, I can't tell.
I won't be hurt if something comes up as sarcastic. I take it seriously and then I'm embarrassed. Like, it just happens to me so often where it doesn't bother me at this point. So we'll give it a whirl. And if it comes up in a conversation, then we'll just have fun with it and we'll just fly by the seat of our pants. I'm not worried.
All right.
I'm used to it.
So do you want to...
Go ahead, Nicola.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your neurodiversity and your kind of, because I know autism is a bit on a scale. So do you want to explain some of yours to us?
Yeah. So I am diagnosed with autism a long time ago. The official diagnosis was Asperger's. As of right now, the diagnosis of Asperger's isn't given out anymore. It's just referred to as autism spectrum disorder. So if somebody says that they are autistic or they have Asperger's, they can refer to the same thing, but not all people who are autistic have Asperger's. Like, if you have Asperger's, the current medical definition is autistic, but you being autistic does not guarantee that you were at one point diagnosed with Asperger's. Right. To make things simpler, I just say I'm autistic. There's nothing wrong with people using that language if they choose to do so, but people really have different preferences for how they choose to describe it. So honestly, like, it's just a matter of asking the person how do they refer to themselves. I say I'm autistic, but if someone wants to say that they have Asperger's, there's nothing wrong with them doing that. I'm not going to give someone a hard time over it.
Yeah. So just so we get a full accurate background, can you tell us how, and you don't have to if you don't want to, but can you tell us how the diagnosis came about a long time ago? many moons ago when you still
it
were
was
an
many moons
actual
ago.
person.
Well, it was many moons ago, and I think that's what makes it me, I would say, honestly, more unique in that sense. Most of the people who I know are either self-diagnosed or received a diagnosis into their later years, if they were an adult or more like a teenager. I had a diagnosis from a very early point in my life. I was about 2 or 3 years old. My grandma on my mom's side and my aunt on my mom's side both worked in the school system, and they were around me often enough to say to my mom, hey, Shea isn't developing the way that he's supposed to at his age. We recommend getting him checked out by a professional. And then they did, and then I got a diagnosis with Asperger's at the time, autism, about 2 or 3 years old. And
wow, that
for
is
most
really
people, that's not how it goes. Most people
right.
struggle for a lot of their life, and then they stumble upon it. But I recognize very much the privilege that I have to have had a diagnosis from such an early point. It's honestly a lot rarer to have a diagnosis at that point, from my perspective. Most people don't have that.
And and correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes like the symptoms or whatever it is you want to call like the set of behaviors or whatever it is are subtle, and it's I feel like in some cases it's subtle and there might not, like, you can explain it away, like especially as a parent, whereas like
my child is just particular, or
my
child is just a bit fussy with food.
It depends a lot on, honestly, circumstance, like nature or nurture, to be totally transparent. For a lot of parents, they may not be aware of what is normal or not. I am very fortunate that on my mom's side of the family, there were 2 different people who both independently said that there was something not quite up to where it's supposed to be. But a lot of folks who I know, that isn't the case, where the parents either didn't know what normal was supposed to be, or, which is also common, they chose to reject what they were seeing. They didn't want to admit the fact that the child maybe had disability or had something wrong with them. And to answer the first question, the way that autism presents definitely varies from person to person. It varies a lot by gender, by race, by sexuality. Like, a lot of the research out there about autism and neurodiversity is, to be honest, mostly about white men like myself. And autism in women is grossly underdiagnosed. It doesn't mean that women have autism less often. It means that the science is not, I would say, where it's supposed to be when it comes to autism. And that is trending in a more positive direction, where it is starting to equalize out. It's not perfect, but we are starting to see more incidences of women getting diagnosed. It's not because autism is growing like a COVID variant would. It's because the science is getting better, and the social situations and scenarios surrounding women getting a diagnosis in the first place are getting better. And that also applies to race as well. We're seeing more non-white people get diagnoses because the science and the social scenario around it is getting a lot better around that even being a possibility.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So are you going to tell us, so I know that you're basically an entrepreneur, right? So you're working on something that's kind of linked with your disability. But prior, and I'm sure we're going to get to that as you tell your story, but when did you really feel like, was there a work situation where you really felt like was not handled properly in terms of your disability, or you weren't given the opportunity to speak freely or anything like that? I think there was one, right? From what I remember.
Yeah. So, and in my time going for different internships and full-time jobs and stuff, my last internship coming out of university, it was a very high stress, high velocity, high everything environment. I'm not going to name names, but it was a very fast-paced tech company. Pick any of the ones that are out there, and I'm sure you can guess. And in that kind of environment, I was basically like just barely getting by in terms of what was expected of me, how much I was expected to know off the top of my head, and how hard I was expected to work. A lot of what was going on was just me not always being able to read between the lines or get into really subtle details about things or ask for help. I was kind of rabbit holing myself down different paths of work, and I wasn't in an environment where I felt that I had the support that I needed to sort of like pull me out of that rabbit hole and give me a reality check in a way that I felt was respectful, because the way that the feedback sometimes came across was more admonishing, not infantilizing, but more disrespectful. And this was in an environment where I didn't disclose my neurodiversity until really close to the end of it. And in that environment, I'd wished that I'd had the support to disclose it earlier. And number two, that I'd felt as though that there was more training or awareness for the managers about me having to mention it in the first place. And I think that was a difficult situation for me, which really revolutionized and changed how I thought about my own neurodiversity going forward for every employer after that.
So do you think that if you had disclosed that like right from the beginning, that experience would have gone differently, or do you think it would have kind of still had the similar experience that you actually had?
I think the mental experience for me would have been night and day. In terms of what I worked on, I would expect that would have stayed the same. But I do believe that had I been more transparent about my neurodiversity going forward, or if there had been more conversations about things that I could share in a way that was respectful with my manager, I felt that a lot of things could have been different in terms of how conversations were had about me, surrounding me, and how I could have used that in the workplace. Because it was an internship. I wasn't expected to know everything and be the most brilliant person in the room. I was close to the bottom of the ladder, bottom of the food pyramid. So, with all that being said, I think it could have gone a lot differently and more supportive in that department.
Okay.
At the same time, though, I was still at a point in my own journey about neurodiversity where how much of this am I expected to know? How aware of it do I need to be to get by? And in that moment, I realized I kind of have to stick up for myself because it doesn't look like anybody else is going to. And that really sort of changed how I thought about it going forward.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Our podcast is powered by the seamless one-click installation and WordPress starter wizard from SiteGround. Choose from pro designs, add contact forms, online stores, portfolios, all automated, no tech stress. Say goodbye to mundane setups and hello to a stunning podcast platform. Join us on Let's Break Up Toxic Workplace Stories and let SiteGround handle the digital stage for you. Launch your podcast website effortlessly, because breaking up with toxicity starts here.
Okay, that's interesting. So, I think the question is, when do you know when to disclose? What are the perfect circumstances where you're like, I feel comfortable to disclose this? Is, in a workplace or even in the interview process? I mean, is that something you should bring up during your interview process? Like, how does that work?
So coming out of that internship experience, that really changed when and where I did it going forward, to answer your question. My opinion now, and I believe this to be really true, is that you should disclose pretty early on in the interview process, which serves a lot of benefits. My belief is that by disclosing disability, whether it's invisible, as is the case for me, or not visible, it can do one of three things for you. The first being that if the company is an inclusive and accessible culture, then it'll make things really easy and supportive and equitable for you. And they will want to support you in a way that respects you and does not ostracize or discriminate against you. Second thing that can happen is that nothing happens. They don't do anything for or against you, but at least that there's context there and they can work with it to the best of their ability. And some companies are better at that than others. And the last thing that could happen is the worst thing, in air quotes, is that they are ableist, don't want to hire you, and they just cut you loose. And at that point, you dodge the bullet, because why work for an ableist company in the first place?
Yeah, I was gonna
if they're going to work
there.
I think in that instance, if you say in an interview and then all of your interviewers after that are ableist or make assumptions or don't know how to speak with you in a way that's respectful, you can just stop the interview right there and walk away and don't feel like you lost anything other than time.
Right. So was there a situation in which, besides your internship, didn't you say you kind of did some experiment though? Like when we chatted originally, like you said you were looking, right? Can you tell us more about that?
So coming out of university, I went to Cornell. Coming out of Cornell,
I told you above average smart. Wait, do you watch The Office? Did you ever watch The Office?
I watched a few seasons, yes. Andy.
Okay, so Andy, yes.
Fun fact, he actually did end up speaking at commencement one year at Cornell.
Did
for
he?
their graduation.
That's amazing.
It was really funny. He was really chill about it. He's like, thanks for letting me talk about your school. He was really cool about it.
Yeah, I love that for everyone involved, because he was such a pain in the ass about it on yeah, he was such a pain in the ass about it on the show that like it's so funny that he's probably not like that in real life, but it's like I don't know if I could ever look at him in any other way other than being Andy from The Office, you know?
He's really
Okay.
chill.
Yeah, I'm sure he is. I mean, to play someone like that, you probably have to be. Anyway, okay, so you did some kind of experiment, right? Carry on.
So coming out of Cornell, applying to jobs left and right. And for most of the time, it's pretty easy. Like fill out your address 20,000 times in the same application. Doesn't remember you. Build your resume, fill it out all again, yada yada yada. And one of the questions that gets asked is, do you have a disability? And there's three answers: yes, no, or I choose not to answer, which is it ambivalent basically. And so I applied to maybe 100, 200 jobs coming out of Cornell, just online applications. And I took the job I didn't really care a whole lot about, like companies that were kind of like not jumping up and down about, but I wouldn't be mad or happy to get a rejection for, and just did an experiment with that checkbox. So for half of this was about a size sample has about 100 or so companies. And for half of them, I said, yes, I have a disability. And for the other half, I said no, or I don't answer. And on average, when I said yes to that, I got automatic rejection more often than if I said no, or I don't answer, which is frustrating. But in the sense that, then again, this is purely an anecdote. It's a perspective. I'm not authoritative. I can't like speak to whether or not that's legal or not. I think my understanding behind that question is it's just meant for like reporting purposes. It is not meant to bias you in the interview process. But from my personal perspective, I don't believe that to be true. Could be coincidence, could be a pattern. I'm just here to say that I saw it as a pattern with a sample size of 100.
That you witnessed that, yeah.
And then even
how
further,
could you? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
So
even further on in, you go.
I was gonna say, and like for every time you got a rejection or you didn't hear back from the people you checked, like how do you know if it was specifically because of that? Like, and especially now in this day and age, you know, they usually have like somebody, like a program, they run resumes through a program. And if you don't have like a certain amount of the keywords they're looking for, it's automatically rejected. It's like before anyone sees anything else. So there's an argument to say that it wasn't because of that. And maybe your resume just didn't hit on those keywords, but you don't feel that way, right?
With a sample size of 50, I find that unlikely, not impossible. It could be that I didn't have what these companies are looking for, and it's completely a valid argument. In my opinion, with a sample size of 50 companies where that happened, I don't know how much I buy that, but it's certainly a possibility that we just didn't have the skills that these companies were looking for times 50.
Right.
But
yeah.
Going beyond that as well, also thinking about companies where I did say it and then I got into the interview and then I talked to a person and then I got rejected. I would definitely say that when talking to a human, seeing how they spoke with me, talked about me, maybe they asked about my neurodiversity or something, whatever it was, that is where I saw more of the human element, more of how people may be biased for or against or ambivalent towards people who are neurodivergent. And it really does come down to what do they know about someone with autism and are they going to project that onto me?
Right.
So and I'm pretty confident that you're talking to a network of people that are in a similar situation to you, where there's neurodiversity and there's potentially autism, or you know, the raft of things that they may bring with them that are completely different. I'm curious to know how that translates into the workplace. What are we seeing happening to these people in the workplace that makes it potentially hostile or toxic? So do you have potentially some examples of how that kind of translates?
Some of the biggest things that I've experienced personally, either with myself or people that I know, is, as you mentioned, that sort of maybe hostile or unfriendly social interactions or confrontations. Since becoming more aware of neurodiversity, I'm able to sort of be more aware and careful of those social interactions, but there were definitely been times in my past when I've said or done something or behaved in a certain way, which wasn't acceptable, but at the time I didn't know any better. And that created a negative interaction or relationship between me and somebody else. And I didn't know any better. So it created a difficult situation for me, for my manager, them having to talk to me about it. And whether or not I knew about it with neurodivergent at the time is a whole nother issue. But I've definitely been in situations where people get really butting heads with me for things that maybe are in my control or out of my control. And it's up to me to manage it and keep my cool. Else I blow my steam, lose my top, or something else happens. And I'll be honest and say I haven't really had like what I would call a breakdown or meltdown in the workplace. I've come close. I've come very close. I've burnt out, which is different. But I know a lot of people who have had a lot of really stressful either sensory or emotional situations go on, and they have chosen to sort of step away from work or or take time to themselves to be quiet. And people don't really know how to handle that. Just only because when you as an outsider with no knowledge of what it means to have a meltdown, have a breakdown, or experiencing that, or seeing somebody who's experiencing that, what are you supposed to do? Most people would leave them alone, but others choose to be more confrontational about it, which has made my life difficult and people who I know's lives very difficult.
How does that look though for you? And like, what would you suggest a coworker who maybe works in proximity to you, but maybe you guys aren't like chummy, you know? What would it look like the best case scenario for you with something like that at an office or a workspace?
If something was happening in a workplace, let's keep it simple. Let's just say it was a sensory thing where like the lights are really bright, or there's an annoying sound going on in the background, or there's a smell, or something which is not related to a person, but just something in my environment. What I would choose to do as a person is just like try to relocate myself to not be in that situation whatever possible. If it's like a smell, like go for a walk or do something else. If I can't do that, if it's like a light like above my desk, then it's more a matter of addressing that with my manager, saying, hey, like this light is bothering me. Can we fix it? Just trying to be respectful about how I address it rather than making it selfish. And where the confrontation, where the negativity comes in is that other people feel like I'm asking for these things or trying to make these changes because I'm being selfish or trying to get a leg up above them. But the idea behind these adjustments, these accommodations is not to create an advantage, it's to create equity. Like, whether or not a regular person or a typical person can work the same with a bright overhead light doesn't matter to me. But if I can't do my work effectively with this bright overhead light, then I would like to change it so I can work better. And 90% of the time, it shouldn't bother other people. But there's a 10% of people out there who feel it's some personal attack against them that, oh, this person wants to ruin my light, so I'm going to give them a hard time for it. And that has happened to me in the past where people give me a harder time than they need to about something that does not affect them at all.
Yeah, people can suck sometimes. Like they just don't, yeah. So that leads me to the next question. Like, if you disclose to, you know, the hiring manager, whoever it is, your disability, like, and then something like this comes up, right? Like, let's say the light is constantly, you know, it's too bright, as you said, right? And then maybe your coworkers don't know that you have a disability. How do you address that? Like, that's right. It's like a personal thing. You don't have to tell everyone. You don't have to announce it to the whole like company. But how do you determine whether or not to tell the people who are in your close proximity?
I think it really depends on the scenario. And in that example where if I'm asking for something that would change their environment or affect them in some way, I think it's constructive to say as little as you need to while still satisfying their curiosity. Because if they hear someone say, I'm autistic, and this is another tangent, but it's an important topic. When I say to somebody, I'm autistic, they immediately associate me with whatever their next closest definition of autism is. It could be a family member, it could be something from TV, movies, whatever. They are going to immediately look at their definition of autism and put it on me unless I choose to tell them otherwise. And that's where things get really tricky. So in the workplace, I need to say to people very carefully, hey, I'm autistic. And what this means is sometimes sensory things such as light, smell, sound, whatever, bother me a lot more than a normal person would. And in a situation of it being like a light fixture, I would say, I'm having a really tough time being able to work because of these lights. I would like to ask HR or building facilities or whoever it is to put like shades over them so it's a little bit darker. And assuming that no one has a problem with it, we can just get it done. And the likelihood that somebody has a problem with it is like really, really low. But in that moment, it's a matter of what do they need to know to empower them with information without getting too personal. I need to tell them about all the other stuff, but like, what do they need to know to support me? And what do they need to know to not feel like I'm being selfish?
Right, like you're just there to ruin their lighting.
Yeah. It's important in that sense. I don't want it to come off that I'm trying to be selfish or really self-serving in this regard. It's about creating equity, not creating another environment just for me. The simplest situation would be if I can move out from underneath that light. That's easy. Nothing else has to change about the environment other than me moving a desk to like a row over or something. But if that can't be done, then we go to plan B, which is change the lights if we can. And that happened at a previous company of mine where a lot of people were complaining about this and enough people did, where HR put up shades above the lights in a certain part of the office, and then building facilities took them down because it was a fire hazard. So that was a big fight going back and forth between HR and building to keep them up, take them down. That was a whole nother can of worms.
Do you find that there's, because, and I'm gonna kind of give this a caveat when I'm done stating my question, but do you find that there's any industries or professions that are more akin to people that could potentially have characteristics of autism or characteristics of neurodivergency? Or do you feel that it's pretty much
equal playing field?
Yeah, open slather.
In my opinion, I feel like when we think about the answer to this question, the first thing that comes up to mind is like IT and engineering. I don't necessarily think that's a fair answer, not just because it's a stereotype, but because autistic people work in every industry under the sun. And just because the large majority of those that we know about happen to be in engineering doesn't mean there aren't others in other industries. So I don't think I can answer that question honestly, because I think to do so would play into the stereotype of they make great software engineers. And I'm not a good example of that because I am a software engineer, but I know a lot of autistic people who are extremely creative, who love to work with food, who are good with their hands, who love to be outside. Like, to say that we belong in one bucket, one industry more than another.
You can only ever do engineering. You're done.
Only software engineering. That's it.
Well, the reason I ask is because at my previous workplace, we had a team of researchers, and it was really interesting work that they were doing. And the majority of the team was neurodivergent or autistic. And some of them were engineers, some of them were not, but it was mainly around research and development for this organization. And it was fascinating to see the dynamics of the team, because you needed to kind of go in with a special mindset to be able to kind of engage or get information out of the team as well. So you've got this team that is just filled with fascinating information. And if you don't, it's like a Rubik's Cube, right? If you don't ask the right question for the information that you need, you're not getting the information. So it's like
I do think,
unlocking
to comment on your observation, I do think that, to be honest, IT and engineering, I would say, attract more people who are neurodivergent and autistic because of the environment that they're working in. But I don't think that means that the majority of people who are autistic work in that industry. But I think it is appealing to people who are neurodivergent in the sense that they have much more flexibility and control over their environments. They have a greater sense of autonomy in that regard. And they can basically do their work without being bothered by as many people, as opposed to, for instance, a customer service job, which is all about working with people. If someone gets really frustrated or has a hard time working with people, that's not a good industry for autistic people. Doesn't mean that autistic people can't do customer service. I know some who are great at that, but it really depends on the individual. And I think, to answer your question, the observation that autistic people enjoy working in the industry is accurate. That doesn't mean that the majority of them are actually there.
Right.
I'm also curious to know, what are some of because I know when we spoke in our meet and greet, we spoke a little bit around the really toxic stereotypes that we've created for autism and neurodivergency, and one of them being hashtag Big Bang Theory Sheldon. And so I'm curious to dive a little into that as to how we've kind of created these toxic stereotypes and how so many people assume that that's kind of the standard or the gold standard of autism.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Before we dive back into uncovering the complexities of toxic workplaces, we have an important request for you. If you find our discussions eye-opening and thought-provoking, consider subscribing to Let's Break Up Toxic Workplace Stories. Subscribing not only ensures you catch every episode, but also helps us reach a broader audience with our message of positivity and change. But that's not all. Leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform goes a long way in spreading awareness about the impact of toxic workplaces on individuals and the solutions we explore together.
I alluded to this earlier, but when people think about somebody who's autistic, one of their first stereotypes is either Sheldon Big Bang Theory or Rain Man from the movies. And that's a very harmful stereotype in the sense that it doesn't constructively represent people who are autistic in a way that does them any respect or justice. It portrays, the Sheldon example specifically, portrays somebody who's kind of mean, kind of selfish, kind of aloof, and all of the negative deficit-based things that autistic people sometimes are, but by no means do they represent everything an autistic person is. It doesn't represent their passion or their joy or their happiness. It's that representation specifically focuses on a very selfish, individualistic model of what an autistic person is supposed to look like, but by no means is that accurate with regards to everything that they are. It doesn't really portray how they make other people happy, what their love language is, how they get really happy and buy in the world. I think it really sort of varies based on the interpretation. And there's great interpretations of autism neurodiversity that are out there, either out there today or being developed. One of my favorite portrayals of it today is actually by Pixar, Disney Pixar. They have a short film out there called Loop, which portrays a non-speaking autistic Black woman, a Black actress, who is going on a summer camp. Like it portrays the story of a child, but the idea being that it's a Black woman who is non-speaking autistic and a Black man neurotypical, Black child neurotypical, and how they interact. That it was very carefully, very precisely designed to be authentic and real. And the actress is also a non-speaking autistic woman. So really authentic, really careful about how it was presented, how it came across, and I think very tasteful, I would say. And I think that it does a much better job of saying this is another flavor of autism and not just pigeonholing us into one stereotype or another.
What I'll do is I'll insert a little clip from the video in the final edit so we can see a little bit of the little view into the mindset of, did you say it was Disney?
I'll put it in the Zoom chat here. Disney, it's on Disney Plus if you have that. If not, there's trailers out there on the internet too. It's Disney Pixar. It's called Loop.
Well, I think it's a good idea to put a little clip in there because, I think it's important for us to really highlight the fact that, neurodivergency and autism, we've said this many times, but it's a spectrum. It could be anything between A and purple.
That's another thing as well. It's not just a spectrum. My personal belief system is that putting it on a spectrum is very linear. For instance, comparing that the individual from the movie and myself, like, is it really linear? Because it's a short film, it's 12 or 15 minutes, it's not long, but so you would never know the whole breadth of life that they live. But I'd argue that they were a lot brighter or smarter or more capable of things than I am in some areas, whereas I succeed in others that they don't. Communication, sensory stuff, emotional awareness, but I'm sure that they're more capable in some other areas that I struggle in. So making it very linear as a spectrum doesn't fully describe, I think, what's actually going on. So I subscribe to the model of it being more of a color wheel, where it's not linear. It's much more, I would say, of a circle in the sense that I can be great in areas involving communication, involving emotional intelligence, but I struggle in an area which involves sensory stuff, very detailed social interactions, or things that are regarding other things related to sensory stuff. Like my struggles vary, but not to the point where it's linear. I know a couple of non-speaking autistic individuals who are far more intelligent than I will ever be, and they just can't talk. So who is, as we say, high functioning, low functioning? I don't like those terms either, but who is where on this proverbial spectrum? Because when you think about it in a very two-dimensional way, you kind of lose a lot of the strength behind it.
I agree with that. I totally, yeah. I'm on board with a color wheel. If we're going a color wheel, I'm there for it.
It's different. That doesn't mean that the spectrum is wrong. We live in a society which refers to it as autism spectrum disorder. That's the medical definition for it. So it doesn't mean that definition is wrong. The color wheel is just a better way to say it. The spectrum is not an invalid way of describing it, but one is better than the other.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's why I said, from A to purple, because you just don't even know where, like, it's not from A to Z, it's from A to who knows what, because I'm sure there's so many kind of intricacies that haven't even been identified yet as part of the process, or even the color wheel, I guess.
Yeah, like it's subtle for some people. Some autistic people who I know love sound. They love clubs. They love parties. They love loud things. They love bright things. They love smelly things. I'm none of those things. So just to say that either one of us
I'm with you on that, Shea. I don't like clubs. I don't like loud things. I don't like overly smelly things.
I don't like bright lights. I don't like people chewing. Like, don't breathe near me. Like, don't even make eye contact most of the time.
I know. That's why that's why we're such good friends, Nicola, because our friendship exists virtually just online, right?
Like, don't breathe near me. You can breathe on a different continent. It's fine.
My eye contact hack is to look at myself on a Zoom call. So that's been one benefit to the pandemic, if there was any benefit to it. Not making light of it, but being on a video call and not having to look someone in the eye, I look at myself, which is a lot easier than staring at somebody else or staring into the camera. I find staring into the camera very awkward, but I look at myself in the camera and it looks like I'm looking at the camera, but I'm not actually. And it actually helps a lot.
But then me, I'd be like, my internal dialogue, I'd be like, God, you're so ugly. Like when you look at yourself so much, like you start picking yourself apart. Like, at least that's what I do. I'm like, so I had to learn the opposite, because I would be, I would always be looking at myself thinking like, oh my God, I have to get this fixed, like very, weird like that. But I have to focus on the person speaking, which I think is really funny. So anyway, Nicola, what do you do?
I do a bit of both. Yeah, I do a bit of both. If I'm getting fatigued in the meeting, I'll just watch myself because I'm less fatiguing than others. But then I like to look at others to kind of concentrate as well. So I'm a bit of both. I'm a little hybrid-y.
You are. I love it. I love the hybrid situation for you.
Ambivert.
I did my first ever in-person speaking thing about neurodiversity yesterday. And it was so weird for me being in person because every other thing that I've done has been virtual. And this was the first time, I think, since the pandemic where I had done it in person. And I'm like, I've kind of forgotten how to read a room, look at the people in the eye and just sort of manage that in person. Because for the past 3 years, it's all been virtual. I haven't had to worry about it. And now that we're back to being in-person events, it's so different. It's just a whole different can of worms.
How did it go?
How did it go?
Oh, how did it go? It went over really well. It was a lot of networking, people who I'd met virtually who I was seeing in person for the first time. Lots of opportunities to socialize, chat about neurodiversity. It was an awesome. The event was hosted by an organization called neurodiversity in the workplace. And they're a great organization to check out, similar to what we do, but they're a nonprofit really focused on empowering companies to also become more neuro-inclusive and really help them get where they're going. It's related to my company, Mentra. We are for profit, they are non-for-profit, so kind of a different track, but similar outcomes.
Okay. Do you want to tell people who might have you do this, Nicola?
I was actually going to go for a totally different.
Go ahead.
Let's go a different rabbit hole. I'm curious to know. So let's say you've got Gina and I as a manager. I'm curious to know what we could do to best support someone on our team that has neurodiversity or autism. What is the best thing that we could do to make that comfortable, accommodating, inclusive, and most importantly, supportive as a leader?
The first thing you should do is just sit down and listen to them. As I said before, your first inclination may be to impose your existing idea of autism, neurodiversity onto them. You need to check that at the door and just listen and talk with them first and hear what they have to say. I am autistic, and this means A, B, C, D, E. And it may line up with your stereotype, or it may not. But you never know if it did or didn't if you just assumed what they needed and walked away. So the first thing you have to do is just sit down and listen. There may be scenarios where an autistic person may not know what they need. They may not know how to advocate for themselves or what they need to be successful. And that happens to a lot of people who are struggling in a workplace but don't know what words to say or don't know what they need to be successful. Lots of companies have ERGs or communities or other sorts of groups about disability or neurodiversity. In those situations, it may be beneficial to pair up this employee, me, with a mentor or someone else from there to help reduce a lot of that stigma with somebody who understands it. Like at both of my previous companies before Mentra, I'll name them because I enjoyed it that much. If you don't want me to, let me know. You can cut it out
Go for later. it. If you feel comfortable naming them, go. That's a good shout out to, hey, these are really cool, diversity, inclusive countries.
We're both struggling right now.
I cannot say words today, apparently. I think it's a stroke.
Words are hard on Thursdays.
Yeah. Well, it's Friday morning for Nicola. It's like 5 a.m. Friday morning.
That's true.
To answer the question, Wayfair and HubSpot were my two previous employers before Mentra. And at both Wayfair and HubSpot, they had disability communities or neurodiversity specific ones. And at both of them, I was able to be a part of different mentorship programs that they had, helping connect people who are disabled or neurodivergent in some way with folks who would benefit from having a buddy or a mentor, somebody who knew what they were doing with disability and maybe somebody who was less confident in themselves. So in this example, I would say having a peer mentor, someone who can empathize directly with their circumstance, even if it's not exact, is hugely helpful. As I said before, two autistic people can be very different. So while having a mentor-mentee scenario between two autistic people isn't guaranteed to have exactly the same results, it'll still be really good to have someone who at least can empathize or understand with their plight and just be able to roll with it and have a good conversation. Even just having the same shared diagnosis or label of autism or neurodiversity or whatever it is. And as I think even having that peer mentor is really advantageous and really powerful. And Wayfair and HubSpot both had that, and I really benefited from having those mentors and also being a part of the programs when they were around.
That's awesome. That's really positive to hear. I think maybe what I'll do as well is I'll head over to the two websites and see, what it is that their statement is, or their do they have a D&I inclusivity statement? Oh my word, the words are not coming to my brain today.
The words are not
HubSpot is huge about this. HubSpot, I would say miles above the rest in terms of creating a culture that is inclusive and supportive and equitable, where people feel like they belong. I really felt as though at HubSpot, the leadership is very approachable. You can have conversations, and the culture around having a disability was really relaxed and chill. And that starts at the leadership level. HubSpot's disability community, their executive sponsor was a person with disability, which I think is huge in breaking down barriers and allowing people to feel comfortable to talk about the disability with their manager. Because if this senior vice president is out there talking about the disability very openly, then I have no reason not to. My manager should care, because if not, this VP is going to go shoot him a new one.
Mm-hmm. That also, who are we talking to who is talking about how affirmative action might affect diversity and inclusion in workplace? Oh, the lawyer.
Stephen the lawyer.
Even the lawyer. Right. Because so he was making the bridge between this whole, what was it, the Supreme Court? Like struck down
the Supreme Court's rule
against
affirmative action is
not happening anymore. And so he was saying, what is that going to look like now in a work spot, like in a workplace, in a work spot? My words are not wording either this morning, Nicola.
Maybe we just have like word-alitis.
I don't know what we have. I don't know what I have.
Brain fart. We have brain fart.
I think we're both brain farting. Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Anyway, he was making, he was saying like, what is that going to look like for American corporate culture if affirmative action, because it's closely related, like in terms of like those boxes that you checked that you mentioned earlier, right? It's like, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I actually spoke about this with someone at the event yesterday.
Oh, cool.
And the current consensus is that it doesn't appear to be affecting the workplace just yet. I think companies are aware of it and sort of reading through what happened and trying to understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of them are ready to pull the plug in anything or yank anything away just yet, but it does seriously bring those programs into question. For instance, there are lots of companies which have a specific neurodiversity hiring program. And if affirmative action at the job company level goes away, then those programs are illegal or obsolete. So then what does my company do? Because we work with a lot of organizations who have these sorts of programs. So that puts my company out of business, but also it makes it very hard for companies to specifically bring in talent who is underserved or struggles with a traditional process.
Right. And I guess because you were saying with HubSpot, the president of the neurodivergent group, is that what you called it? I don't know. They were
a vice president in some of our capacity in HubSpot who has a disability, who is the executive sponsor of the disability community.
Got it. Okay.
Disability more broadly, not just neurodiversity.
No, right. That was my mistake. So like, and this is going back to what the lawyer said earlier this week, that it's like, how important is it to have people in these powers of like in leadership positions and so on and so forth who look just like us, whether, and that's where the diversity and inclusion comes in, right? So it's like,
we need leaders from all different backgrounds, and that's not what we're still kind of stuck in this 1990s vibe where it's male, pale, stale up at the top.
Wait, exactly. I have never heard that, male, pale, stale.
A huge part of it is seeing like those leaders out there who are neurodivergent or have disability in some way, shape, or form. Like, and there's not a whole lot of them that are out there which are so open and transparent about it. Something that I try to do in my life as a leader is to be open about it, to break that barrier down. My co-founders at Mentor do it, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot of other people who are out there talking about their experience with disabilities as frequently or repetitively as I think they should be. That's not the fault of them. People have different levels of personal comfort with the topic. But if more people were out there talking about the disability or neurodiversity and destigmatizing it a lot less, the conversation would be so different. For instance, a good example of this is Richard Branson, who is the CEO of Virgin. He has dyslexia, and he's really open and talks about it all the time. Great example. A counterexample might be someone like Keanu Reeves. I love him dearly. He's like one of my favorite male actors of all time. He has, I believe he has dyslexia. Doesn't talk about it as often as I think he could to have an inspirational or motivational impact on others with dyslexia. That's not to fault him in any way, shape, or form. I love this man to death. I think if he upped the ante and how much he talks about it, he would really have a massive impact on people who look up to him and respect him.
Yeah.
And it would cause more people
You
to look
think
up to him and
Keanu is
respect
going
him
to be
too.
listening to our podcast?
Yes.
That big-
Who
that
knows?
question. That's the thing,
100%.
though. You're 100% right. You just don't know, right? You never know where in the world it's going to end up. So you're right. But I would be so stoked as like, you know, growing up in like the late 80s, early 90s, like if Keanu Reeves like ever.
I had to check. He has dyslexia for sure. I wasn't if it was dyslexia or ADHD. It's dyslexia. But
Okay.
I love this man to death. I love The Matrix. I love John Wick. So
Yeah,
all the
and
best
he
of luck to
seems-
him.
I only just recently discovered John Wick. It's a little violent.
Movie tangent.
I know. But yeah, Keanu Reeves is pretty awesome. So it would be cool if he
I
actually
love
did
him.
listen to
I
our
love him
podcast.
dearly.
Yeah, maybe we should tag him in the social medias.
Baby.
Yeah.
He's like my celebrity guy crush. Him and Josh
okay.
Groban. I love Josh Groban.
Oh my God, Josh Groban on The Office, to bring it full circle, as Nicola would say. Did you see any of the ones that he's in?
I didn't know he was at The Office at all.
Oh my God.
I've watched
Now I
all
gotta
of
write
The
that
Office
down.
and I do not remember this. Did I sleep through that episode?
He plays Andy's little brother, who's favored.
That's news to me.
Wait, hold on. Watch me be totally.
This is news to me too, where I'm like, hold on. I literally recently binge watched all of the seasons because I was like,
oh my God, yes, it's definitely him. Okay. Let me just
Okay,
get
I'll
you
look
an
it up.
I'm sorry, I'm here for it.
Okay, he's in okay. He's in the garden party one. When Andy has Andy has the garden party at his at Dwight's beet farm.
Oh yes, now I remember.
Oh.
Yeah, and then he does like he has a couple cameos later on, like when Andy's the manager and his parents die or whatever, and then they're on the boat to like Bermuda or whatever. He has a few cameos there, but he's been in a lot of like TV shows because he's like always so funny.
I love him. He's on Broadway right now, and I want to go see him.
Oh, do it.
You should.
Where's Broadway in relation to where you are?
4 hours from me.
4 hours.
Broadway, New York.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah,
I have a
train
volcano
down.
4 hours from me. Like I get it.
Yeah. Well, all right. So, Nicola, do you have any other questions, comments?
Burning questions. I think I'm really happy that we covered off like what we could do as leaders to better accommodate for people that may have neurodivergency and potentially autism or whatever it is that they disclose. I'm curious to know more about Mentra though. So how did this come about and what was the haps there?
So I met the co-founders of Mentra February 2020, right before COVID shut things down for the very first time. I met with them, we hit it off really quickly, and we decided to really start to figure out how we're going to take this idea that they had. They had the idea. The way I describe it is they had the dream, and I was the artist who could make their dream a reality. I was doing all the engineering tech work. They were the ones that came up with like actually what we were going to do. And that really launched us into what is now Mentra. We have like 34,000 job seekers 3 years later. We work with companies all over the United States. We've gotten almost 100 folks hired over the last year or and a half. And the sky's the limit as far as we're concerned in terms of getting folks hired in a way that respects them, get them into jobs that are equitable environments for them, where they feel like they have the support and structure they need to be successful, and also educating other companies about how they can do better for their hires, not just people who they're hiring, but people who are already in their organizations. A big part of where these neurodiversity initiatives don't succeed in is they only focus on hiring, just getting people in the door. And then once they're there, it's like, oh, okay, you're done, have fun. But the reality of it is that if neurodivergent people don't have what they need to be successful in their company, they're just going to leave. They're going to be either forced out or they'll quit. And Mentra also focuses on empowering companies and embedding within them or assessing their neuro inclusivity, how inclusive they are for neurodivergent individuals, and helping them improve and grow and become a company that people really want to work for. And companies come on to Mentra and they talk about their neurodiversity. Why should a neurodiverse individual, a neurodivergent individual, want to work for you? Why should they bother? What makes you special? And then for the job seekers themselves, we ask them, talk about your neurodiversity. What do you need to be successful as a neurodivergent person? What are your superpowers? And then also the generic stuff like work history, schooling, skills, and stuff like that. So it really is a mixture of balancing how to allow these neurodivergent aspects to come out for the job seeker and the employer. It's wild, it's crazy, it's chaotic. I certainly enjoy it. It gets me out of bed in the morning, and it really is just an awesome thing to do.
So did you guys all had previous experiences working for other companies, being, neurodivergent, and that's what gave you this idea? Like, how could this have been smoother? How could it have been better suited or inclusive for someone like me? Is that sort of the impetus behind the idea?
So that was my experience looking into it. To be honest, for Connor and Angelica, the genesis of the company came from Angelica. She has an older brother who is non-speaking autistic. And she gave a TEDx talk at Georgia Tech. And she's also a keynote speaker at the Grace Hopper Conference down in Florida, a massive conference for women in technology that happens every year. She was a keynote speaker, I think it was 2019. And I saw her keynote and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I want to get behind this. Connor and Angelica are now diagnosed as being neurodivergent. That didn't happen until a year or so after they founded Mentra. So they didn't know that they were neurodivergent themselves until they sought a diagnosis from a medical professional, which is very expensive and very confusing and time consuming as you become an adult. It's a lot easier when you are younger because there's more to work with, but when you're an adult, there's much more resistance to it.
Okay. So that's interesting though. So they had like their careers already sort of in front of them, and the whole time they didn't realize
that they had whatever it is that they were working with,
diagnosed with. Yeah. So that's so interesting. But okay, so how did you meet them?
On the subject of a late diagnosis, it happens really frequently if someone is around someone else is neurodivergent and they're like, oh wait, I'm seeing a lot of the same things in them that I see in myself. Maybe there's something going on here. Or they're in an environment where the stigma or the conversation around neurodiversity is much more positive. Or they have the money and the resources and support structure for a diagnosis. There's a lot of reasons why someone can get a diagnosis later in life. And there's a lot of reasons why someone might not be able to. It is definitely an oddity, but I would not say that it is rare. It happens a lot more often than people think for the reasons that I mentioned and for others.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I feel to answer your question, go ahead, sorry.
No, I also think like there's just more transparency about it, like especially over the last like year or so, like people are starting to talk about it fairly freely. So I think it kind of opens it up for people who, like you said, who might not realize it or until they're around someone else. But, because like I feel like this is what's happening with ADHD. Like everyone's talking about ADHD, right? And how everyone's, especially women, I feel like a lot of women are recently
I've found that especially on
like
Instagram,
our age, like 35 to 50, I would say. Like like people I followed for years on Instagram, now they're saying, well, I was just recently diagnosed with ADHD, and they're within our age range. And it's like, that's on one hand, that's fantastic. Like, great. Let's normalize it. Right. But on the other hand, it's like, is this just a diagnosis that is being like I think that's what you're reacting to. It's like, oh, you can't concentrate on one thing for like more than an hour, so you're automatically ADHD. So it's like, I mean, I don't know. Because a lot of the ADHD characteristics, like I feel like you and me, Nicola, would fit right in there. So I'm like,
hyper independence, hyper focus, high functioning.
Aren't those just trauma responses? Like,
I know, and I'm like, I personally would probably not get Like I wouldn't go to get a diagnosis, even if I've got these similar traits to someone else, because I'm like, I'm pretty confident that that's a trauma response.
Same. And I'm like, what's the difference? What's it going to make? What's the difference? Like, let's say it is something that can be diagnosed. I'd be like, okay, and like, I still operate this way. So like,
it's not changing the way I'm doing things.
Right. And it's like, it's been successful so far. So
but then isn't that like the key takeaway here, right? Is you've got an entire group of individuals that have neurodivergency and autism. And regardless of their diagnosis or not, that's still the way they're going to operate. So it's about, making sure that there's those accommodations in place, because it's like, well, just because you have slap a label on it and put it in a jar doesn't mean that person's going to be any different because of it. They're just going to be exactly who they are and live their true self.
The idea behind a diagnosis is not that it's meant to change things or like really make it like a flashpoint type of thing. The idea is some people need a diagnosis to get access to medication. A workplace may need a diagnosis before they can give accommodations or something like that. It really varies on an individual's needs. So, and the most common example is getting a diagnosis to be able to get medication either at a much reduced rate or free or something else, or as justification for the doctors that can go out and get a prescription for you. It really is, it's not meant to make anything different, but it can also have the social effect of helping you understand, this is why I've been struggling for all this time. This gives me now a community, a framework within I can find self-help without medication, if that is what you want to do. It provides closure to a lot of people to say, this is the name for that thing that's been bothering me for all this time.
That's a really good point as well. I think that's probably the piece of the puzzle that you and I were missing, Gina, was that it does provide access and, kind of availability outside of kind of your scope where you were previously.
Yeah. And I also think like, and this is my fault, like now thinking more about it and as we're talking it through, like ADHD and neurodivergency are like, you can't really compare them. Like they're completely okay.
And again, I'm no doctor, just to be clear. But isn't ADHD a type of neurodivergency?
It is. ADHD is considered part of ADHD is a way of describing somebody who's neurodivergent. Like one of my co-founders, Jillica, is ADHD and autistic. She's neurodiverse in that regard.
Wait, I might just be really old. I didn't realize that.
And I realized this.
You can be
autistic.
You're
younger than me.
You can be autistic and be neurodivergent, but neurodivergent does not mean that you're autistic. Neurodiversity covers a lot of related definitions.
Yeah, ADHD is part of the family. It's part of the family group of stuff. Again, not a doctor. Like I'm just now lumping it into a group of stuff, a family of stuff that happens.
It's related.
It's related. Family. Okay. So even with our example of ADHD, like that was the part we were missing. Like, okay, having that diagnosis kind of opens up access and availability of things that maybe you wouldn't have before.
And I think, you know what? I'm just, now that we're talking this through a little bit more and I'm having time to percolate on this a little bit, is I don't think that you and I are the only two Muppets on the planet that had that same thinking. Right?
Oh, no, for sure not. No, we're both Muppets.
That too. But it's all over Instagram right now. That ADHD stuff, especially for women, is all over Instagram. And if you and I can make the same assumptions based on the information that's provided to us and not really know all of the facts or the details, we're not the only Muppets on the planet that have probably done that.
Oh, for sure we're not. Because we're Muppets, yes, but we're not not intelligent. You know what I mean? Like we're two intelligent women who, can have conversations about this. Some of them sometimes better than others. Today's not our top work. I don't know why we showed up with like peanut butter for brains. Just goofy. But yeah, I mean, now that I think about it, I probably did know that ADHD would be considered, like part of the whole neurodiversity on that. I don't want to use the word spectrum on the color wheel. But I think you hit the nail on the head, Nicola. It's the way it's being portrayed. Nobody is talking about ADHD as being neurodiverse. They're calling it ADHD, and that's where they're leaving it.
Yeah, and then they give you, do you have these traits, right?
And I'm like, everybody under the sun has those traits at some point or the other.
Exactly. And I think they're not kind of delineating between these, they're not really giving you any more information other than, you probably have ADHD because you have these same traits. And it's like, well, not quite, right? So I think actually this has opened a whole can of worms that I think we weren't expecting.
Now you got something to talk about.
What?
Now you got something to talk about, I said. A big part of this is like, people have really different experiences with neurodiversity. Some folks live their lives neurodivergent, and there's nothing wrong with them or with that. Like, I live my independent life. I'm getting married in a month and a half. I do my own thing. Some folks need a lot of support to get through the day. Some folks live with their parents or in a group home and need every support they can get. So the experience of neurodivergent people really varies greatly from person to person. And the moral of the story is not to assume everything about someone based off of a diagnosis or a label, and just sit down and talk with them. It's really important to just like be a good listener. It's something that I struggle with, just being a good listener.
Personally have found this conversation really fascinating, and I think it's kind of also kind of unpicked our own biases a little bit as well. And I think it gave an opportunity to be a little bit more reflective, even just our conversation around ADHD, right? Like that just kind of opened up, that thinking even further, which I'm hoping it will help others to kind of think differently too. So I really appreciate you coming on, Shea. It's been fabulous chatting to you.
Conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for letting me borrow some of your time to talk about neurodiversity, share my experiences in the workplace, talk about movies, Deadpool, John Wick, Keanu Reeves, all that stuff. I love talking about it. Thanks for having me.
And tell us where people can find you. Give us websites, handles, whatever you want to give us.
I'm on LinkedIn, Shea Belsky. There's only one of me. There's only one person with my name out there. And if there isn't a person out there with my name, tell me and I'll fix it real quickly. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. On TikTok, I'm starting to post some more like neurodiversity content about that in the workplace. I am autistic_techie, which should be a fun little handle to remember. But if not, you can find me one place or another. Just look up my name.
Okay.
It's as I say, it's been awesome chatting to you. And I think, we kind of came into it probably blinder than what we thought we were.
Absolutely.
And I think it's been really great. So really appreciate it.
It's never too late to learn something. Thank you so much for having me again. This was a blast.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Let's Break Up, Toxic Workplace Stories. If you enjoyed our candid conversations and insights, don't forget to hit that like button, follow us on social media, and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.